So these programs that we've been running on Wednesday afternoons are Stacy Vero's brainchild to help us fulfill our mission by being in touch with the community, keeping you connected to important preservation advocacy efforts and technical advice and partners, and offering you an opportunity to chat with us and with our professionals that we bring on to host with us. So please feel free to ask questions either in the chat or in person at the end of the program, and we are happy to discuss what you have on your mind today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Falvey. And Mary, you can share your screen if you'd like to.
Okay, let me just get my, whoops. There we go. And you can see that all. I hope you can see a
yes.
Pretty picture of our state capitol in 1886. So hi everyone. Yes, so I'm Mary Falvey. I am president of Connecticut Preservation Action, which is nonprofit advocacy group in the state of Connecticut for preservation policies and legislation. And thank you to Jane and Stacy and the rest of the staff of Preservation Connecticut for inviting me on today. It's always great. I try to get in as many of these talks as possible. And if I can find the button. So just to give you an overview of some of the things, Connecticut Preservation Action was started in 1981, much at the urging of the Commissioner of Historic Preservation at the time. And since then, these are just a couple of the things that we have worked on your behalf to either get passed through the state or to keep in play. So in 1981, 1982, the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act and Protection Act amendments, which essentially is one of our strongest tools for preservation in Connecticut, which allows anyone from the community to work to, if a property that's on the state or national historic register is threatened with demolition, it offers us a last chance, and sometimes the only chance to get it preserved. And in fact, Jane and I just skipped over a hearing is being held as we speak on a property on Main Street in Clinton. 1994, we helped support Connecticut Main Street program coming online. 1999 was important for us. The Historic Homes Rehabilitation Tax Credits came into being and was in later years brought throughout the state, which essentially allows up to 30% back off of renovation costs to historic homes, up to $30,000. This is important, especially in our urban areas where we have a great density of historic properties. 2005 was our Community Investment Act. And I know Preservation Connecticut was also extremely helpful and fundamental in getting that passed. And Community Investment Act, which we love our acronyms, the CIA, is funded through a $40 land recording fee that is then split up between historic preservation, agriculture and dairy, open space acquisition, and affordable housing. And to date, well over $152 million has been returned to the community to help with that. And we have a great share in that helps fund, besides Preservation Connecticut, Hartford Preservation Alliance, which I'm the executive director of. Important grants are the Historic Restoration Fund grants and survey and planning grants that allow properties to be put on the national registers, also condition assessments for historic properties. So this has been extremely helpful to all the communities across Connecticut. And then in 2006, we had the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Act passed, which now has is allocated $31 million each year and that provides the tax credits for commercial properties, especially. It's been used extensively for renovating our older mills in all of our towns across the state to turn them from vacant properties, some of which have been vacant for decades, and now are being reused either as mixed use or as residential. And so an important part of our work that we've done since 2009 is, should say, preventing and defending a sweep of Community Investment Act funding. Unfortunately, when we've had bad budget years, this is a fund where legislatures and especially the governors think, oh, well, here's a pot of money that's really not that important, and we'll just take it to balance our fund. So we've worked diligently in keeping those, if there are sweeps or deflection of funding, to a minimum. The last time we were presented to this was 2 years ago with the Governor Lamont's first budget that he presented, where it looked like it was intact, but in fact, it was a diversion of funds. And it was actually our partners at the state legislatures. It was our legislators, representatives, and senators who themselves pointed out that they weren't keeping it intact and that they were very much against it. So we've worked hard through the years, not just myself, but my predecessors on the board, in developing these relationships with the legislature so they understand the importance not only of preservation, but keeping this Community Investment Act intact. So for this year's legislative session, I don't want to jinx it by saying so far it's been quiet for us, but the governor's budget didn't indicate any programs on his part for diverting any money from the Community Investment Act. That being said, it's Community Investment Act is considered an off-budget item and fund, so we will have to be diligent in making sure that no bills get slipped in later on down the line to divert any funds. And right now before us, we have House Bill 6547, which is an act concerning a working group regarding the protection and preservation of historic properties. That is going to be part of a public hearing on Friday with the Planning and Development Committee of the legislature. We will be in support of this. This basically is what it sounds like, doing a working group. And we will, however, and I'll mention it later as well, we will put out a call to action for people to support this, but also requesting that they ask the members of this committee and their legislatures to make sure that the preservation groups across the state are included in this working group. As the legislation now stands, Preservation Connecticut would be part of the working group, but then it doesn't mention to have any of the other groups like Hartford Preservation Alliance, New London Landmarks, New Milford Preservation, Norwalk Preservation Trust, and New Haven. So that's just some of the things that we'll be keeping an eye on this year so far. And we never know what will come up, so always stay tuned. So one thing I wanted to talk about, and I was asked to talk about, is how can you, those of you on the call, be a preservation advocate for us. So the first thing is to join us at Connecticut Preservation Action, and certainly hopefully you're members of Preservation Connecticut, and we will occasionally issue what we call calls to action, that something is coming up in front of the legislature that we need you to respond to. And even if you can't, nobody's testifying in person these days, it's all on Zoom, but just sending in written testimony when something comes up for a committee hearing is just very impactful. So this slide that you're seeing now was a call to action I forwarded on with my HPA constituency in 2019, when there was a bill up that would have diluted our protections under the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act. So in putting this call to action. At the same hearing, I just wanted as an example, the same hearing had a bill that was kind of controversial at the time and probably still is, where they wanted to be putting in these big solar farms in open, especially farmland. And so you see they got 1, 2, 3, 4, they got 6 respondents for testimony, which is a pretty good showing. These committee hearings sometimes can have 10, 20 bills in front of them. So this was a really good showing. But in the call to action that we did in the preservation community for the bill that we were concerned with, we received this response. And this, and this, and this. So we had over 100 people testifying, not only many of them, some of them in person, but just sending in their written testimony. And this was really impactful. In fact, one of the feedbacks we got back after the fact was this was an issue that everybody in the Capitol was talking about. So it's important. Everybody working together, every vote counts. Whatever you do, if it's just sending an email in response to a call to action, adding it up, it's extremely, extremely important. So another thing we ask how you can get involved is by staying in touch with the work that we do with the Community Investment Act Coalition. We are hopefully planning sometime in mid-April to have a virtual lobby week, which how that will basically work is that we will begin sending out calls to action, but requesting that people send into their legislatures an email that week to let them know that you are a preservationist or you are in favor of dairy, you're in favor of all of it, and how important it is to have the Community Investment Act fully funded and stay with us. So that's something for you to consider. And certainly, get my certainly the PSA section of this talk is, we hope you'll join us at Connecticut Preservation Action and support us. It's important for us to be able to hire a lobbyist, which we have not been able to do so far this year, but having a paid professional lobbyist is just extremely important to having us know what's going on. Things can change so fast. And also being on our mailing list to receive these calls of actions, to know what's happening and what we're doing and what's going on. But then also just please follow us on Facebook. We try to post as we can. Our website is listed there, ConnecticutPreservationAction.org, as well as the CommunityInvestmentAct.org has a lot of good information about the CIA. And that was my presentation.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, and I just want to piggyback off of what Mary was saying about the importance of the Community Investment Act and the importance of everyone responding to any calls for action. Your membership with Preservation Connecticut, with Historic Preservation Alliance, with Connecticut Preservation Action, any or all of those memberships, you're all part of our coalition, and we need your voices at the legislature to help promote historic preservation in our state. And I think one of the reasons that we have pretty solid support from the legislature on the Community Investment Act is because so many people do reach out to their legislators and tell them specifically some of the projects that have been meaningful in their communities. All of the grant money that comes through the State Historic Preservation Office for survey and planning grants, for Historic Restoration Fund grants, our funding for Preservation Connecticut, our Circuit Rider program, all of the grants that we award, that all comes from the Community Investment Act, and that's all programming and projects that your legislators need to know about, and they're always very happy to know about and receptive to being invited to ribbon cutting ceremonies or tours or anything that you can do in your community to celebrate preservation work. The Community Investment Act website does maintain a list of all of the projects that are done in historic preservation, in open space, farmland, affordable housing. So it's a good resource if you wanted to check and see what was done in your town. You can also anytime reach out to me or Mary for more information on how to connect with your legislator. But it's really the success of that program is because the community is responding and letting their legislators know that this money is important. It's money that's being invested back in our communities in Connecticut for all of the things that we hold dear: open space, farmland, water, main streets, historic preservation. It's what makes Connecticut a special place to live and work. And the legislature has been very supportive of that program.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add to that also that you know, let your legislators know who you are and what you're interested in, and they actually encourage you to do that. One easy way of doing it is, you know, sure everybody gets a newsletter from their legislator, or even when they're doing campaigning, they'll send you something, and just take that and send them an email right away and say, thank you for your newsletter. Thank you for keeping us informed. But, you know, by the way, I wanted to let you know I'm extremely interested in preservation issues and keeping the Community Investment Act funding intact. So give me a call anytime if you need any information, or keep me informed on what you're doing to do that.
One of the other perennial to watch items on our legislative agenda each year is to not only protect the Community Investment Act, but to make sure we're protecting our historic tax credit programs. And that's another area where reaching out to your legislators, if you know that there has been a project in your community, to say, you know, this is great, look what's happening in downtown New Britain, you know, these tax credit programs are important. We try to each year make sure that the legislators, especially those that are new coming on board, make sure they are aware of the programs, make sure they are aware that these are economic tools to bring investment into Connecticut. They are not items that are taking away from the budget. Sometimes they're misinterpreted as being something that is taking away from the general fund, but the tax credit programs are actually bringing money into our communities. And we've done case studies and other studies to support that we're happy to share with legislators, and I'm happy to share with you all as well. But Connecticut State Historic Tax Credit Program and the federal tax credit programs are really important to historic preservation in Connecticut.
So Jane, I don't know if you saw a question came in beforehand, and it said, would someone touch on how to support legislation and other topics while balancing being a state or municipal employee? It can be a complicated dance sometimes.
Well, I think if you're writing in as a private citizen, you have the right to do so on any legislation. I don't know if someone else can correct me if I'm wrong. Certainly you can't use your office letterhead or your office email. But I think on that part, that's allowable. Jane, I don't know if you know anything, and I know someone from SHPO is on the line, maybe wants to. Kathy's here.
Yeah, hi. It is a very delicate dance. So what we are allowed to do as state employees is we can provide education. We can talk about what the potential impact would be on our jobs and doing the work of the state. What we can't do is engage in anything that would technically be defined as lobbying. So we can work within that advocacy side of it, but understanding where that line is between lobbying and just advocating, that's where usually the confusion comes in. And so I always try to, tell people when certain groups ask that particular question is, if you phrase everything in terms of education and how it will impact what you do, you're usually on the side of right in terms of just doing the advocacy part of it and not crossing that line to lobbying. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Kathy.
And Wendy, you asked when will COVID-19 rules lift to allow circuit rider visits? We're doing them now. So if you have we try to stay outside for the most part, but we end up going in sometimes. As long as people aren't living inside of a building, we try to stay safe. But yeah, we're doing them now.
Thank you.
And also to bring to your attention, next week is Advocacy Week in Washington. Each year, preservationists descend upon the Capitol the second week of March to convene and organize around historic preservation agendas. So next week will be a virtual lobby week, and there's programming all week through the National Preservation Action organization. And there's training sessions, there's opportunities to meet the new leadership and new members of the Biden administration who are coming on. And it's just a great opportunity to sort of see what's happening around the country and to convene. And I know a lot of folks from SHPOs will be attending as well. And being virtual makes it easy to pop in and out of meetings, and they're scheduled from the 8th to the 12th. So I encourage you to take a look at that and sign on if you're able to participate in that as well. And similar to the agenda in Connecticut, the main agenda is to protect preservation funding through the Historic Restoration Fund. So meeting with our local congressional delegation to make sure they are aware of the importance of the funding and to continue to protect and advocate for that.
Could I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Tim.
The CIA funding, the agriculture and dairy, I was unaware of that. And I don't know if that's for functioning dairy farms or dairy farms that have been out of existence for quite a while. I don't know.
So my understanding is for dairy specifically, they are actually get their funding right off the top when it's divvied up, and it's for functioning dairy farms. So it's part of it is to provide them with the economic funds to keep them in business, because it's considered such an important part of who we are in Connecticut. And agriculture takes on all different things, so it's up to Department of Agriculture to divvy it up. I know some of the funding goes to like food security in the cities, so anything that touches under the Department of Agriculture, but it's also, you know, farming and subsidies, urban farm things. So yeah, so it's dairy, agriculture, affordable housing, which often goes hand in hand with preservation, because a lot of times that comes from rehabbing an existing mill building or another property, and then open space acquisition. Well, good question, thank you.
Well, I wrote something and sent it off to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation this week, as well as the World Economic Forum. They're working together about revamping agriculture. This is kind of a long project, but my brother's dairy farm, there are two older dairy farms that have been inactive for some time, right border my my brother's farm, and they're buying farmland from Bill and the Melinda Gates Foundation. And
Okay.
I'm very curious. I'm
And-
very curious. 'Cause that
And then
would,
preserving it, or?
yes, yeah. And that would certainly help my brother's farm quite a bit. But they certainly want quite a bit of money for all this land. And my brother's farm, can't do that. So I'm curious to see what we'll hear.
Did you say where your brother's farm was?
Enfield.
Enfield, okay.
It's a Smith Trinity Farm. Yeah.
Okay.
Mary, you had mentioned partnerships with affordable housing. What other types of organizations do you partner with most often to create successful projects or help to save buildings?
From Hartford Preservation Alliance standpoint?
Yeah,
Or-
maybe from a more of a local standpoint. Yeah, the Hartford.
Yeah, well then first and foremost, it's the local preservation organization.
Mhm.
Have really good working relationships with our city departments. So Hartford has and I'm getting that the connection's unstable, so forgive me. Hartford has really ramped up their blight remediation ordinance, and they are very good at keeping me informed of historic properties that are threatened. And they're the person that's interim director and hopefully will be permanent director is very much preservation minded. And what they're working towards is trying to get a hold of these properties before they become totally ruined, and demolition is the only option. We also have the first land bank in Connecticut here in Hartford, the Hartford Land Bank, and it's kind of a weird term, but basically a land bank is set up to take in distressed properties, whether they're distressed physically, environmentally, or sometimes it's title issues. And then the idea is then to be able to get that back into the community with a private owner. So recently the city of Hartford deeded over to the Hartford Land Bank 7 properties that they had foreclosed on for tax reasons. Our blight remediation ordinance also has the ability to foreclose if blight fines pile up and they're not being paid. And they are going forward with quite a few of them as we speak. So then again, they'll hopefully go to the land bank, who then in turn is going to work towards either getting a local community-based developer to rehab the building and either rent it or to get it into private ownership hands. And they're concentrating right now on home ownership to hopefully get people to work. We're never going to get 100% owner occupancy in Hartford. No city does, no city should, but at least some of these neighborhoods need to have some more ownership. And the Hartford Land Bank's been supported by a grant from the housing department at the state of Connecticut. So those are some of the people we work with.
The land bank is it?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone else have a question?
There's also, we in Hartford, we're working very closely for the last couple of years with our neighborhood organization. So we have neighborhood revitalization zones in Hartford. So we've been partnering a lot with them. And I call them my collection of spies, my spy network. So I'm very much dependent on the community to let me know if something's happening, if something needs to be addressed.
Or the land bank, Mary, is that enforced by a building official at the city level? Is it handled sort of at the city level? The
land bank is a separate nonprofit.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
it's a separate nonprofit that's been set up. So then the hope is then it can be sustaining by, it receives donations. In this case, right now it's the city of Hartford, and then the proceeds they get by selling the property to someone, then those funds just get reused, especially for operating costs, because, you're saying, they got the buildings for free, but you have to have insurance. And since they're vacant properties, that can be very cost prohibitive. And the grass has to be mowed and the sidewalks need to be cleared of snow. So we're excited to see how that's going to work. And there has been 2 years ago, we had the enabling legislation came in for all the cities to have something similar to this.
Thanks, Mary. One of the questions that came in ahead of time with registration, do you plan to add any protections, to advocate to add any protections for properties on the historic register?
So statewide, we're rather unusual, I believe, in the country. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that we have included historic properties in our environmental protection legislation. So essentially back in the 80s, the state legislature said that we consider our historic sites and our historic buildings to be just as important to the citizens of Connecticut as clean air and clean water. For the statewide, I don't know. We do have a few years ago, and Preservation Connecticut championed this one, there is enabling legislation already passed and on the books, which allows for municipalities to do a townwide or citywide ordinance to protect properties. So most places I know, they may have a local historic district, but not necessarily, and not everything in town that's listed on the registers is covered under this commission. In Hartford, we have a citywide ordinance which says any property listed on the state or national register of historic places is protected. For those buildings, if someone wants to do exterior work that requires a building permit and can be seen from the street, they need to get permission from our city preservation commission to do the work. And we have a whole set of guidelines which follows the Secretary of the Interior standards. So that's been a huge protection for us in Hartford, and a few other towns. New Britain has followed, Milford has followed suit. It also requires that this commission is the decider on whether they can do demolition, which has saved multiple buildings already for us in Hartford. And we think, we would hope that we can get a lot more municipalities to have an ordinance like that.
And just to piggyback on that, the important thing is getting properties listed. State register and national register are mostly honorific, and they serve, and that is a really important thing, to have sites identified, their significance identified, it's recorded. Being listed on the state or national register by itself doesn't encumber the property owner in any way. There's no oversight. It does offer the property owner advantages for historic tax credit programs and other advantages. But if the property is not listed and something happens in your community and you all of a sudden want to try to do something to protect it, there's not a lot we can do at that point. Like Mary said, in Connecticut, it's really unusual that a national register listed property does have the backing of the State Environmental Protection Act. So in that case, if there's a proposed demolition that's unreasonable, then we may have an opportunity to intervene or ask the Attorney General to intervene to negotiate something. But if nothing's listed, we get very sad that there's not a lot we can do. So survey work and doing a lot of community outreach and making sure, you know, people in the community know that these properties are important, and seeing if they do want to come together and put forth a district or individual listings, and working with property owners to protect what we have. That's my plug. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, through the Community Investment Act, there is funding available to fund getting a district put on the registers, the state or national. So that's important to do. Absolutely. Yeah, and just to give you some kind of a scope for Hartford, how important that was for us, I have 53 local, state, and national historic districts in my boundaries, which is a little over 5,600 properties that are covered now under this ordinance. Another great thing about this ordinance that people don't necessarily think about, but it covers infill construction. So the commission has say over what gets put into a vacant lot in a historic district, which I think is really important, because many of we don't have design review in our planning process, and I'm sure that a lot of others, municipalities, don't as well.
And another question that came in with the registration, looking for grant money for restoration and repair. You want me to take that one, Mary?
Oh, so for the restoration fund? Yeah, why don't you do that one?
Sure. Grant money is always what people are looking for. So first of all, grants are available to nonprofit organizations and municipalities. Grants are not awarded to private property owners. That's what the tax credit, homeowners tax credit program is for. But if you're a 501c3 or a municipality, there's grant funding through the State Historic Preservation Office and through Preservation Connecticut for survey work, for condition assessments, architectural, engineering, anything that you need to do to plan for a restoration project. And then the State Historic Preservation Office has a historic restoration fund, which will fund up to $100,000 of a capital repair project or restoration project. And Preservation Connecticut and our circuit riders, Stacy is one of our circuit riders, can help facilitate that. We'll do the initial site visit, see what your scope is in your project and where you need to start, if you've already got architectural documents or not, and get you on the path to lining up your project timeline and your funding sources and what you need to get that project done.
Yeah, and Nanette asked, are those matching funds? Yes, the historic restoration is a matching grant, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
It's actually a reimbursement grant, so you get reimbursed at the end.
Can you explain that again? What is that? Whatever you just said, reimbursement.
It's reimbursement. So you would have to pay for the project in full. And then at the end of the project, you close it out, you submit, your paperwork, and the SHPO, signs off that it was done according to the plans and the Secretary of the Interior standards. And then they would refund you the amount of the grant. So you get paid at the back end.
So for example, you mentioned 100,000. If my group spent 100,000, spent 200,000, and then I would get reimbursed 100,000.
Correct.
Through this grant. And if I spent less than that, I'd get whatever I spent reimbursed, correct? Like a matching?
Yeah, you have to think of it as a dollar for dollar match. So if your total project cost was $50,000, you would pay the full $50,000 up front, and then at the end, you could potentially get $25,000 reimbursed to you through the state grant.
So most groups, if you had that much money, you wouldn't need the grant in the first place. So do groups take out a loan, get the grant, and then pay it back?
Yeah,
I don't have $100,000. I don't have $50,000, but I need that much work done.
Right. I was just going to say, when you get approval for your project through that restoration fund, you can literally take that to the bank. And that helps a long way, saying, look, we have this grant that will be coming through to pay this off. So you may be able to get a construction or a short-term loan, depending on how you work with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm working with an organization too who has to phase out a number of high ticket number projects. So right now they're fundraising $100,000 for a roof, and hopefully can apply to the State Historic Preservation Office for the restoration fund. And so they'll pay for their roof in full, potentially get half of that reimbursed, and then once the money comes back, then they have that money available to do the next phase. So their fundraising is constantly building off of the phase before. So it takes some planning and some patience, but
That's all I have is patience, and I have none of that.
Well, you need it in preservation. Right, Jane?
That's right. And that's why having the circuit riders and other professionals help you, identify what the priority needs are, getting that building stabilized and buying you time so you can raise money and keep plugging away at your restoration project. That's really important, to be able to plan carefully for a long-term project. And then beyond that, you'll be planning for maintenance too. So there's always going to be that cycle of anticipating needs, fundraising, planning, and taking care of your property.
I think someone else also had in the chat, I think Christopher, about heard of the rules being broken or sidestepped. No, that never happens. One thing, when we get out of this COVID crazy world, on my list for CPA is we would like to see more teeth in our planning, the ordinance, building codes, but including any with the preservation codes that we have, because quite frankly, now it's cheaper to say, oops, my bad, than it is to do work required sometimes to keep buildings up and occupied. We lost last year, we lost 2 carriage barns in Hartford, which you can't replace. So we would like to see, and that has to go, I believe, at the state level. The state has to enable legislation to allow us to increase any penalties and fees.
Then Christopher also asked, have we considered crowdfunding as a worthwhile path for fundraising? Yes, right, Jane, we encourage people to do that. I don't know about Mary, if you've had any projects have success with that.
No, because actually we don't own property in HPA. Mm-hmm. But we help work with, there's another group that was working with Hartford residents for programs. So, and again, it was like a matching kind of a thing, but yeah, and it's in preservation, it's tough. It's, we're not hitting some of the buttons that people like to see, but it's sometimes people don't realize how important it is until after the building's gone. And we try to work to, Jane and I and all the rest of us here doing this are trying to get in front of that so that never becomes an issue.
Exactly. Save it now. When it's torn down, everybody's like, oh no, we should have saved it.
We should have saved it. But yeah, well, where were you?
I'm trying to be in front of the cart here, but it's not working. You try to work with the IRS. Okay, sorry, my little soapbox.
No, I know you definitely need patience to set up your 501c3 these days. So that absolutely is that. Oh, and someone also had Christopher advocate with your AIA leadership yes, preservation into the codes. Yeah, and thank you to the Connecticut chapter of AAA for giving me their public service award a few years back. So they definitely recommend preservation. And as I put to them in my, we're natural allies with the architects, is I let them know is, if you want the work you're doing today to still be up in 50 years, you better be supporting me now, because we need to build in the culture that all the architect. We're working now is mid-century, the 1960s, as much as people were like, oh, we thought Victorian was pretty and why did you tear it down? And now we have this. Now we're fighting for these 1960s buildings that replaced the Victorian era buildings to keep that architecture up and going.
Yeah, and we just are seeing a lot of demolition notices coming over our transom lately. I think, everyone is looking to purchase real estate in Connecticut, it seems, and we've seen a really heightened level of demolitions. So we are concerned, and that's why we're saying, people in the communities need to be aware that these are happening, and if we can, work with you to help organize your community efforts in putting forth survey work or planning or education programs. I did a program recently with Greenwich to help talk about what some of the benefits are, the value of properties that are in local historic districts, how they maintain their values over time, better than properties that are designated but not in a local district. Anything that we can do to bring to your communities to help educate folks on what's available as resources, we are happy to do that, and we encourage you to reach out to us to set that up.
Yeah, as Jane said, we could do sort of a preservation 101 in your community if you'd like, and we team up with the SHPO to do that for local historic districts, and we're happy to do it in a broader sense as well.
Tim, are you talking to us? You're on mute.
His phone rang I think
Okay.
he's on another.
Let's see. We have a couple of minutes left. If there was anything else anyone wanted to bring up.
I think Bill asked, if time permits, please review the Clinton House in this context. He asked about that. I think the one that was
the hearing today.
Yeah, that's something we don't generally discuss. I mean, but
I can just tell you what the process was. So the property is listed in the National Register. So by itself, there's no local review of a National Register property, but it was slated for demolition, and there was enough of an uproar in the community to bring in Preservation Connecticut and the State Historic Preservation Office to take a look at it. And right now they're presenting an argument to the State Historic Preservation Council to see if there are merits for asking the Attorney General to intervene. So we said, that's really unusual for a National Register to have that kind of protection, and that's unique to Connecticut as part of our Environmental Protection Act. So those cases are fairly rare where they go to that level, but it is something that is available as a tool for National Register properties. And I just wanted to add to that as well. Sometimes we get contacted to stop a demolition, and while it's true we want to protect the historic property, we don't necessarily want to stop the development of the site. So what our team usually does is propose alternatives to demolition that include the reuse of the historic building, while also showing that the development of the site is feasible and what the developer and maybe the town and the community want to see on that site is also compatible with the historic property.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So fingers crossed that it'll be a fairly quiet legislative session with the Community Investment Act.
From your mouth too.
But if we're, you know, keeping our eye on it at all times, and everyone, when you have a chance to reach out to your legislator and thank them for what they've supported in your community, that makes this an easier job for us and keeps that threat at bay. And it really is important for our communities to be able to have that investment. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's nice to see you all and glad we could answer some questions, and hope to see you at the Capitol someday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it so much.
Anytime. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.